Hello, this is Dr. Ken, joined today by my teaching assistant Bear, who may decide to stay or not. And I am going to have a talk with you today about Plato's myths of the Ring of Invisibility and the story of Atlantis. This is a talk aimed at the speculative writing module at my university, for which I should be giving a lecture and seminar next week. However, in the great spirit of democratic Athens, anyone who wishes is welcome to watch this. So, as I said, this is about two stories found in Plato's dialogues, which are fiction. They fall into the category of fiction in some sense. And of course, Plato uses fiction for a number of means, mainly as a vehicle to get across his philosophical ideas. And this connects to the lecture itself, in which I discussed the dramatic dialogue form. All of Plato's works are dramatic dialogues, apart from the poetry, which is debatable. But anyway, and they are, in that sense, works of speculative fiction. They are, produced in a fictional format to get across a message. This is why it's very difficult to say what Plato believed, although there is some consistency across the dialogues, and that probably reflects his own beliefs. But again, the dialogues are fictional and therefore to be taken with a grain of salt, I suppose. The two stories that I'm looking at one comes from the Republic, and the other can be found mainly in the Timaeus and in the Critias. So I'm going to start with the myth of the Ring of Invisibility, or the tale of the Ring of Invisibility in Plato's Republic. It's to be found in Book 2 of the Republic. It's rather short, but it's an interesting story nonetheless. So the Republic, in case you're not sure, is about defining justice, and it does so through a number of means, partly by positing hypothetical utopian cities, and the city is seen to be a kind of parallel to the psyche of a human being. So he talks about the organization of cities, or polities, political systems, and how they reflect the internal construction, if you like, of the human mind. The dialogue, the Republic, is concerned with justice, and Plato's definition of justice usually entails something along the lines of moderation, not going to excess. So in the course of this, we have one of the characters in the dialogue, a man named Glaucon, I believe, who is a relative of Plato's, and he's talking with Socrates about the notion of license. That is to say, what would people do if they could get away with just about anything? And of course, the fictional Socrates is going to say, well, the just person might have the opportunity to get away with something quite horrendous, but wouldn't take it because they're just. I'll just go through the story itself, which is used to illustrate this point, or at least it puts forward a hypothetical scenario that is worth considering. It's worth all of us actually considering, because you might ask yourself, what would you do in a similar situation? So he describes in this story an individual who he doesn't name. He's the ancestor of a king of Lydia, the ancestor of Gyges, king of Lydia. Whereas Lydia, that's in modern day Turkey. In Plato's time, in the 5th and 4th century, it was part of the Persian Empire, although it had been an independent kingdom at one point. And before I get into the tale, it's worth pointing out that we don't always know where Plato gets these things from. One gets the impression that this is maybe not entirely made up, although probably enhanced in some way to get across Plato's philosophical message. The story itself, the story of Gyges, who's descended from this character who finds this ring, I'll come back to in a minute, is to be found in Herodotus's histories. book 1, in fact, but he doesn't mention anything about a ring of invisibility. He just mentions that Gyges was a kind of a person of questionable morals who usurped the previous king through a trick, through trickery, and through taking advantage of a situation. So I suppose that's in keeping with the character of the individual in the story who's meant to be his ancestor. Well, this is the story. I'm going to go over. I'll summarize bits of it, but I'll quote bits as well. He says, this is the story which men say came about the license, that is to say, the opportunity that came to the ancestor of Gyges the Lydian. And this is what he describes. He says, they relate, who they are we don't know, I'll maybe come back to that in a minute, who they might be. They relate that he was a shepherd in the service of the ruler at that time of Lydia, that after a great deluge of rain and an earthquake, the ground opened and a chasm appeared in the place where he was pasturing. And they say that he saw and wondered and went down into the chasm, and the story goes that he beheld other marvels there, and a hollow bronze horse with little doors. And he peeped in and saw a corpse within, as it seemed, of a more than mortal stature, and that there was nothing else but a gold ring on his hand. He took it off and went forth. It doesn't tell us what happened to the great bronze horse with doors or windows in the side of it, or this giant creature of larger than mortal stature. Maybe there was there's no point in speculating, but I've used an AI to draw some images of what perhaps this might have looked like, or how we might imagine it today. And obviously, I don't want to go down the path of UFOs or anything like that, but describing a primitive, what we'd call a primitive shepherd over 2,000 years ago, might describe a crashed craft or vessel of some type as a bronze horse with windows or doors in the side. So anyway, you can see what the AI has drawn. I'll link to that in the description if you want to go there and have it draw some things for you. I'll also link to the lecture on the dramatic dialogue form. So, okay, the guy takes the ring, and he goes and gathers together with the other shepherds. They're about to make their monthly report to the king about his flocks. And he wears the ring. So as he sat there, it chanced that he turned the collet of the ring towards himself, towards the inner part of his hand. And now, so you call it, it refers to a kind of a double layer on the ring. So parts of it turn, apparently, independent of each other. So he turns one part of the ring, and having put it on, playing with it at this conference of shepherds, turns it on and finds that he turns invisible. There we go. Leave that off for now. Yes, he became invisible. Those who sat by him, and to those who sat by him, and they spoke of him as if he were absent. He was amazed. Again, fumbling with the ring, turned the collet outward, and so became visible. So he's got this magic ring that will turn him invisible. What's he going to do with it? Becoming aware of this, he immediately managed things, we're told, so that he became one of the messengers who went to the king. And on coming there, he seduced the king's wife, and with her aid set upon the king and slew him and possessed the kingdom. So that's what he does with this magic ring of invisibility. And of course, like I say, in Herodotus's version, Gyges himself, partly ostensibly to help the legitimate king, but ends up also seducing the king's wife. So there's an interesting parallel to the story. Where does this come from? First of all, I don't know. We can't trace this to its source, or I've not been able to. Now, it is a fact that Plato's father had been an ambassador to the Persian court. And one can imagine that there might have been ambassadors or visitors from Persia regularly in Plato's house. And if so, then, perhaps one of them related this story. It sounds like something that would come out of the 1001 Arabian Nights, although that's obviously a bit later, but some of those tales are derived from earlier times. So if anyone knows, or if anyone perhaps acquainted with, Eastern or Persian or pre-Persian mythology knows anything about this tale, please feel free to comment below, because I would certainly like to know more about it myself. So I can speculate that Plato perhaps heard it from a visitor who was acquainted with his father, or perhaps he made it up himself. We don't know. So having related this story, we get a kind of a suggestion that anyone who got hold of a ring like this would probably behave badly. So the character says, if now there should be two such rings, and the just man should put on one and the unjust the other, no one could be found, it would seem, of such adamantine temper as to persevere in justice and endure to refrain his hands from the possessions of others, and not touch them, though he might with impunity take what he wished even from the marketplace, and either into houses and lie with whom he pleased, and slay and loose the bonds whomsoever he chose, and in all other things conduct himself among mankind as the equal to a god. So the interlocutor, the person speaking to Socrates, says, well, even if we put this on a just person, a person who's considered to be just, they would not be able to resist the temptation. For that there is far more profit for him personally in injustice than in justice, than in justice itself, is what every man believes, and believes truly, as the proponent of this theory will maintain. So the person talking to Socrates says, well, yeah, nobody could resist this temptation. But Socrates, and again, this is perhaps Plato's message, says, well, actually, the just person who is not ruled by their appetites, who is, moderate and ruled by reason, would not use such a magic ring for evil. And how can we test this? I'm not entirely sure. But you see how, first of all, this story relates a message, a moral message, but it also opens up whole vistas of possibility for other people to come along. I mean, this is quite possibly the origin of any notion of a kind of ring of invisibility in mythology, and it is absolutely certain that J.R.R. Tolkien read this story. We know he studied Plato at university and probably even before, and this is 99% certain this is the inspiration for the One Ring of Tolkien's fiction writing. And in that, of course, as well, we get the question of, can a person, can someone resist the power of the ring? Frodo struggles with it, doesn't he, in that story? Galadriel is offered it, but she is afraid that she'll become a terrible kind of tyrant using the ring's power. Note, and this is often missed by those who study Tolkien. I'm saying this as an aside, but it's relevant, in terms of speculative writing. It's Bilbo, not Bilbo, sorry. It's Samwise who is able to resist the ring's power in the end, who is truly a just individual. He is, and I think Tolkien has even said he's probably the hero, the true hero of the story, because he doesn't succumb to it like Frodo did. Or Bilbo for that matter. So yeah, interesting that this story spawned that one, and probably a range of others as well. I have another video on a paper that I gave, and that is now going to be published in the next year or so, on Tolkien's adaptation of Platonic and other philosophical views from the ancient Greeks. So this, what I'm saying, is not unusual or out of the ordinary for Tolkien to have been influenced by these things. And if you're interested, I'll put a link to that one below as well. So that's the Ring of Invisibility. And as I say, you perhaps have a think amongst yourselves. What would you do if you had such a ring? I admit that I would be strongly tempted to do things. I think that I would try to do good things with such a ring. I would try to redress wrongs or put the world to right, but who's to say that I would be that I wouldn't succumb to something like what Plato would define as injustice were I to do so. So there's the Ring of Invisibility, found in Republic Book 2. The other topic that I want to discuss, and it's another example of Platonic fictionizing, if you like, is the story of Atlantis, to be found in Plato. So we get it in two dialogues of Plato. One is the Timaeus, which has been described as a rhetorical display. The Timaeus is generally placed in the Platonic canon as coming directly after the Republic, in which a number of hypothetical city-states, and their political systems are being considered. And in this we get some part of the Atlantean myth, not the whole thing. I'll go over that in a moment. The main dialogue in which we get the most vivid description of Atlantis is the Critias, and Plato often put his own relatives into the dialogues, cousins and uncles and I think brothers as well. Who is this Critias? We're not completely sure. It's either his mother's cousin, who appears in several other dialogues, or it's a cousin it's that cousin's grandfather. And this character Critias is going to tell the story of Atlantis, and like I say, the most detail comes from the Critias. But it's as with the story of the Ring of Invisibility, the origins of this tale are very hard to pin down. In both the Timaeus and the Critias, we're told that the story came from Solon, who was an ancestor of Plato's, so on his mother's side, and so it makes sense that Solon lived in the 6th century, late 6th century BC, or mid to late 6th. So Plato never knew him, but possibly his great grandfather did, and that's perhaps how the story could be related. And Solon himself, who is alleged to have traveled far and wide, got it from some Egyptian priests. Now, in terms of epistemology, which is how do we know what we know, or how do we know that things are true, it's very hard to trace this myth back beyond Plato himself. It would be nice if some texts survived from an earlier period. It would be nice if we had some Egyptian corroboration. There is one story in Egyptian mythology about the land of Punt, which is said to be rich in incense and spices, and some have thought that might be what the story of Atlantis comes from. We simply don't know, and we don't know whether Solon actually talked to some priests and they told him this or not, although it's entirely possible. We can also, as with the Ring of Invisibility, assume that Plato is either adapting another story that he's heard, or he's completely making it up. And I suspect it's probably more an adaptation, but I don't know. I'll go through the story. Actually, I'm going to go through the Critias version first, because in a way the Timaeus version gives us the conclusion of the tale, which is missing from the Critias. The part of the Critias is missing, and it's what happens to Atlantis. So the story begins with a discussion about societies and their organization. So Critias again typically is placed in sequence right after the Timaeus, so following along from the Republic. Pardon me, and the Timaeus, which again deal with ideal societies and ideal ways of organizing your psyche. So the tale is said to be 9,000 years in the past. So this dialogue is happening sometime in the 4th century, late 5th, early 4th. So 9,000 years before that, which puts us roughly at the end of the last ice age. And it describes not just Atlantis, but an ancient Athens as well, which is described in rather idealistic terms too. Now we know that there was actually a Mycenaean settlement in where Athens is located. The Acropolis Hill was where one was located. The Mycenaeans are Bronze Age Greeks. These are the Greeks of Homer. And so that's we're talking about 1200 BC, not 10,000 BC or so, or 11,000, but 1,000 BC roughly is the Mycenaean settlement. Was there something there earlier? Well, I don't know. The story kind of implies that whatever was there got wiped away. And he does describe this sort of ancient idealized Athens, and how these old civilizations from roughly around 10,000 BC disappeared. He says, by reason of the destruction of those who received the tradition in the lapse of ages, for when there were any survivors, they were ones who dwelt in the mountains and were ignorant of the art of writing. So he's saying basically time wiped away the history of these things. But interestingly, in the early Athens that he describes in this tale, the Athens that was somehow contemporary with Atlantis, you've got sort of mythical characters associated with the gods being present. But the organization of society, too, is interesting. He says that military pursuits were then common to men and women, and men of those days, in accordance with the custom of the time, set up a figure and image of the goddess, that's Athena, in full armor, to be a testimony that all animals which associate together, male as well as female, may, if they please, practice in common the virtue which belongs to them without distinction of their sex. And this is a theme that we find repeated in Plato, at least in his speculation about ideal societies, that men and women can be equal, more or less. The women still have to give birth. They haven't solved that one yet, I suppose, but they can be in the military, they can be in the government, they can do the same things as men can do. This is a revolutionary idea at the time, and certainly in the Athens of Plato's day, where women are upper class women at any rate are normally kept indoors. They go out with a veil on, accompanied by some guardian. Lower class women did work in the public sphere, but it was looked down upon, and they were severely restricted. They were second class citizens who couldn't vote, etc. So he couches these philosophical positions within fictional stories, because that's one way to avoid perhaps public censure. He describes the Athenian society as having artisans, husbandmen, a warrior class, and priests. So it's a sort of stratified society. And they apparently shared everything in common as well. There was common property. Everyone had a very high standard of living, but they shared everything in common. Again, that's a feature of some of his other utopian fictions. He talks about the reason why, again, no evidence of this survives. He just says many great deluges, floods have taken place during that time, during the 9,000 years. During all this time, through so many changes, there's never been any considerable accumulation of soil coming down from the mountains as in other places, but the earth has fallen away and sunk out of sight. So he's basically describing, geological changes or that equate to geographic changes, so there are no ruins to speak of. And I'm not going to go over much more detail about Athens, except that he does describe this mythical ancient Athens as being a very moderate society. They took the middle course between meanness and ostentation. They built modest houses. They had gardens and gymnasia, dining halls, etc. And they took care to preserve the same number of men and women through all time, being so many as were required for warlike purposes then as now, that is to say about 20,000. So they had some kind of, we would probably call it eugenics, but maybe population control in effect, and that's also a feature of some of Plato's utopian fictions. So you get the description of this mythical idealized Athens that existed around the same time as Atlantis, and then we get the description of Atlantis itself. And again, it comes from Solon, who was intending to use the tale for his poem, inquiring into the meaning of the names, and found that the early Egyptians, in writing them down, had translated them into their own language, and he recovered the meaning of the several names, and when copying them out again, translated them into our language. And Critias says, my great-grandfather Dropides had the original writing, which is still in my possession, and was carefully studied by me when I was a child. So if this exists, if this exists, it would be great to have it. No one's ever found this original writing by Solon, but maybe we will one day, and then we can trace the story back beyond Plato. Anyway, Critias is going to describe this mythical Atlantis of roughly 11,000, 12,000 BC. And it turns out that the people of the city are descended from the gods, particularly the god Poseidon. He begot children by a mortal woman and settled them in that part of the world. So he describes that, and then Poseidon, being a god, uses his powers to make the city itself. Breaking the ground, enclosed the hill in which the woman dwelt all around, is the mother of the children, making alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which he turned as with a lathe, each having its circumference equidistant every way from the center. So you have to imagine a number of concentric rings of land and water, and that's what the island of Atlantis was meant to look like. Where is it? Well, Plato writes, it's situated beyond the Pillars of Heracles. That's the Straits of Gibraltar today, so in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, thus the name Atlantis. So the initial population comes from the god and mortal offspring, and they are described as a very sophisticated, advanced civilization that exerted a great deal of authority over other civilizations. For because of the greatness of their empire, many things were brought to them from foreign countries, and the island itself provided most of what was required for them for uses of life. They worked with a metal known as orichalcum, which we don't know what this is, although it was said to be, very strong, but also, malleable and resilient. Their society is described as having basically infinite abundance of food and the things that they need. The city itself consists of many temples and palaces and harbors and docks, and there are bridges between the different zones of the sort of concentric circle. Towers and gates and bridges. And lots of metal used in construction. Buildings with coatings of brass. And then Poseidon's temple itself is described as immense, a stadium in length, and I'll put a measurement as how long a stadium is, and half a stadium in width. So a stadium there. And of a proportionate height, having a strange barbaric appearance, he says. All the outside of the temple, with the exception of the pinnacles, they covered with silver, and the pinnacles with gold. In the interior of the temple, the roof was ivory, curiously wrought everywhere with gold and silver and orichalcum. In all the other parts and walls and pillars and floor, they coated with orichalcum. In the temple, they placed statues of gold. And there's a statue of the god himself in gold, on a chariot, surrounded by lesser goddesses and sea creatures. So metallic buildings and this giant temple to Poseidon. And they held sway over many foreign cities, we're told. Oh, they had hot and cold running water too, which is interesting. And lots of public fountains. They had aqueducts and land for horses and so forth. I'm not going to go through the entire description of the island. Apparently, so the concentric circles of land and sea are also surrounded by mountains which descend towards the sea. It's well defended, this place. And it's all artificial. This is the point. That he says the god made it, but then the people also apparently create or produce a number of artificial land forms around it. Heavy engineering going on. Apparently they were also they had a very effective army. He describes them as a vast multitude, and they chose their leaders by lot, and they had 1,200 ships in their navy. And the city was divided up among 10, he calls them kings, we might call them rulers or magistrates or something like that, but I'll keep the word king in the translation. So each of the 10 kings in his own division and in his own city or portion of the so think of Atlantis as a country with many cities that are part of each other or connected to each other. His own division had the absolute control of the citizens and in most cases of the laws, punishing and slaying whomsoever he would. So you've got, the kings are meant to be enlightened, and so they're not tyrannical. They would apparently meet, and the laws of Poseidon had been handed down to them, inscribed by the first kings on a pillar of orichalcum, which was situated in the middle of the island at the temple of Poseidon, and the kings would gather there every 5th and 6th year alternately, and they would have consultations, pass judgments, etc. And there were games as well. Apparently hunting bulls without weapons, but with staves and nooses. Now that's interesting because we know that the Minoan civilization, and I'll put some images up of them, practiced some kind of not exactly bullfighting like you imagine with in Spanish societies or Hispanic societies, but also with a kind of gymnastics involving bulls, and that's, I suppose, that we're meant to recollect that with the Atlanteans, or maybe this is where the Minoans come before the Mycenaeans. Their civilization is more or less contemporary with Egypt. It goes into decline in the 14th century BC, and they were replaced by the Mycenaeans. So some kind of connection with the Minoans. Anyway, after these festivals, the kings would perform rituals with golden cups. They swore that they would judge according to the laws on the pillar, and would punish him who in any point had already transgressed them, and that for the future they would not, if they could help, offend against the writing of the pillar, and would neither command others nor obey any ruler who commanded them to act otherwise than according to the laws of their father. And when they gave judgments in court cases, they would write down these judgments on a golden tablet and dedicate that to be a memorial. So this is it's actually pretty sophisticated legal practice to keep precedence of your judgments. We do that, and so did the Romans and other societies with advanced legal systems. So Atlantis is described as a sort of utopian society where people descended from the gods pass proper judgments and follow the rules laid down by the gods, which are considered just. But a theme that we find recurring with Plato is a tendency towards degeneration. So in the Republic we get something called the nuptial number, which is effectively an equation by which he says even the best of societies, if you sort of plug the numbers in, you'll get, it'll show how it degenerates into less just societies. And this happens with Atlantis as well. So Plato writes that for many generations, as long as the divine nature lasted in them, they were obedient to the laws and well affectioned towards the gods, whose seeds they were. Utilizing gentleness with wisdom and the various chances of life, etc. They despised everything but virtue, caring little for their present state of life and thinking lightly of the possession of gold and other property, which seemed only to burden them. Neither were they intoxicated by luxury, and nor did wealth deprive them of their self-control. But they were sober and saw clearly all these goods as are increased by virtue and friendship with one another, whereas by too great regard and respect for them, they are lost in friendship with them. So going to excess gets rid of the good things. But when the divine portion began to fade away from their blood and became diluted too often and too much with the mortal admixture, and the human nature got the upper hand, they then, being unable to bear their fortune, behaved unseemly, and to him who had an eye to see grew visibly debased, for they were losing the fairest of their precious gifts. And the gods see this. Zeus calls a council and starts to speak, and then that's the end of the dialogue. So we've lost the last part of the Critias that tells what happened to Atlantis. Fortunately, we do get a summary of that, perhaps, in the Timaeus, which I mentioned earlier. And I'll just go over that now briefly. It's not very long at all. and it's the retelling of this tale, but in a very summarized form. It talks about the island of Atlantis, where there was a confederation of kings of great and marvelous power, which held sway over all the island and over many other islands also and parts of the continent. They ruled over Libya as far as Egypt and over Europe as far as Tuscany. So quite a powerful empire. And one assumes that the period in question that's being discussed in the Timaeus is near the end of Atlantis, when they start to become more unjust. And then in the story, and again this is meant to come from some Egyptian priests who talked to Solon, they attempted at one time to enslave by one single onslaught both your country and ours, so the Egyptians said, and the whole of the territory within the straits. So all the Mediterranean. He says the Atlanteans invaded the Mediterranean and were trying to enslave this ancient mythical Athens that Plato had described. But then the priest told Solon that your state, that's Athens, showed itself conspicuous for valor, acting as leader of the Greeks, and it defeated the invaders and reared a trophy whereby it saved from slavery such as were not as yet enslaved, and all the rest of us who dwell within the bounds of Heracles, again within the Straits of Gibraltar, so the Mediterranean, it ungrudgingly set free. Saying, so the idealized ancient Athens that we get described in the Critias fought Atlantis in a battle, won, and liberated the colonies that were under their control. Then he says, but at a later time there occurred portentous earthquakes and floods, and one grievous day and night befell them when the whole body of your warriors, so the Athenian ones, was swallowed up by the earth. And the island of Atlantis in like manner was swallowed up by the sea and vanished. Wherefore also the ocean at that spot is now become impassable and unsearchable. So, and that's more or less the end of what we're told. And again, this was given by the elder Critias, as he heard it from Solon. So, if we take, though that's in the Timaeus, if we take the story from the Timaeus, it looks like the Atlanteans were being unjust, and they were using their super weapons or whatever, their advanced technology, to enslave others and to acquire wealth, being ruled by their appetites, which again follows the Platonic formula. And like I say, we have the bit missing from the Timaeus, from the Critias, but it's the gods apparently get involved. And then in the Timaeus we're told that it's an earthquake comes. It doesn't just destroy Atlantis, it destroys this idealized Athens as well. And that's the end of the story. We're fascinated by this tale. I think everybody's been fascinated by Atlantis since Plato told the story. But for Plato, again, it's mainly just about trying to get across a message that excess, that giving in to your appetites all the time, not being moderate, can result in injustice, can result in maltreatment of others, and ultimately results in one's own destruction. And that is the message. That's the message of both of these tales, really. And to some extent, to a lesser extent, the Ring of Gyges, or ancestor of Gyges, but it's not dissimilar. It's the same sort of principle. That's Plato's intention. Whatever his intentions, though we can be inspired by these stories, as indeed many people have been. They have spawned many other works of fiction, both in writing and in the modern world, in the cinema, and even in the digital realm through computer games and Disney cartoons. So I'll leave it there for now. We'll see what you think of this, and like I say, if anyone has any insights or comments they want to make, please feel free, and I shall wish you fair sailing. I almost forgot to say goodbye for my teaching assistant, who's been very helpful with me today. Say goodbye to the folks, Bear. Bye-bye.